23-year-old lieutenant from Lawton, Oklahoma, sat in a burning cockpit 5 miles above the fields of Normandy and tried to open a canopy that would not open. His name was Robert Samuel Johnson. 21 20mm cannon shells had gone into the fuselage of his Thunderbolt in a single burst that had lasted less than 3 seconds. The canopy above his head was shattered into a spiderweb of frosted plexiglass. Hydraulic fluid, red and hot, sprayed across the instrument panel and caught fire on the pilot lamps. A shell fragment was lodged in his right leg. A machine gun bullet had grazed the tip of his nose, and blood was running back into his oxygen mask. The aircraft was falling out of the sky in a flat spin from 25,000 feet. He tried to bail out. The canopy would not slide back on its rails. He tried again. It would not move. The fire was climbing up the sides of the cockpit toward his face. The date was the 26th of June, 1943. The pilots who had done this to him were watching from above. They belonged to the second group of Fighter Wing 26 of the Luftwaffe, based at Vitry-en-Artois in occupied France. They had been briefed that spring in ready rooms across northern France and Belgium on the new American fighter their reconnaissance officers had photographed at English airfields. They had studied its silhouette. They had studied its weight. They had laughed. To understand why they had laughed, and why one of them was about to die for it before the year was out, and why Robert Johnson would not, we have to go back to the spring of 1943. In April of that year, the airfields of the Luftwaffe stretched across northern France and Belgium in a chain of concrete and canvas, from Beaumont-le-Roger down to Vitry-en-Artois. Fighter Wing 2, called Richthofen after the great ace of the First War, kept its Focke-Wulfs at Beaumont. Fighter Wing 26 kept its own at Vitry and at Lille Nord. These were the men who had ruled the sky over the English Channel for 3 years. They had shot down Hurricanes over Dunkirk. They had shot down Spitfires over the Isle of Wight. They had shot down 4-engine Halifaxes and Sterlings in the summer nights. They had names and photographs in the German illustrated magazines. Some of them, the highest scorers, wore the Knight's Cross at their throats. That spring, a report reached them from the reconnaissance flights and from the intelligence branch of the Luftwaffe High Command. The Americans, it said, had a new fighter. Its designation was P-47. Its manufacturer was called Republic Aviation. Fully loaded, it weighed 7 tons. The German pilots read that number twice. Their own Focke-Wulf 190 weighed less than 4. Their own Messerschmitt 109 weighed less than 3. In a turning fight, the lighter machine won every time. Every pilot who had trained in Poland or Germany or occupied France knew this in his bones. Weight was death. Weight was the difference between the man who landed and the man who did not. And here were the Americans, sending them a fighter that weighed twice what a fighter should weigh. At the airfield at Vitry, a 28-year-old major named Wilhelm-Ferdinand Galland looked at the intelligence sheet on his desk and shook his head. His squadron mates called him Wutz. He had been born in Bochum in October of 1914, the middle of 3 fighter pilot brothers. His older brother Adolf was the general in charge of the entire Luftwaffe fighter arm. His younger brother Paul had flown for the same fighter wing and had been shot down and killed over Belgium 6 months earlier. Wutz had taken command of the second group in January. He had 55 confirmed aerial victories. He had been awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in May. He was by any measure one of the most dangerous fighter pilots alive. He looked at the silhouette of the P-47 on his briefing sheet and set it aside. The intelligence estimate for that month, preserved in the war diary of Fighter Wing 26, remarked on the new American type and estimated that it would not be a difficult opponent when the time came. Adolf Galland would write later, after the war was over and the archives were open, that his pilots had looked at the shape of the P-47 and had not known what to do with it. Its fuselage bulged in the middle. Its nose was blunt. Its cockpit sat far back on the airframe, like an afterthought. They did not think it deserved a nickname. They studied the silhouette. They set the sheet aside. They went back to their beer. 6,000 miles away, in a town called Farmingdale on Long Island, the machine they had dismissed was rolling off the assembly line. Republic Aviation had built its plant on marshland north of the Great South Bay. Inside the plant, 30,000 workers, most of them women whose husbands had gone to the Pacific or to England, drove rivets into aluminum by the hour. The man who had designed the aircraft was Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian emigrant who had left the Caucasus 20 years earlier and never gone back. He had built the P-47 around a single engine, a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial that produced 2,000 horsepower. The engine was so large that Kartveli had been forced to build the airframe around it, not the other way. That was why the fighter looked like it did. The pilots sat behind the engine and behind the turbocharger and behind the ducts that fed the turbocharger cold air from below the belly. Every inch of the fuselage carried something. 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns lived in the wings, 4 to each side. Each gun could put out 800 rounds a minute. Together, they could tear through half an inch of steel plate at 300 yards. And none of that mattered if the airplane could not fight. And that was the question no one on either side had answered yet. The first squadrons of Thunderbolts shipped to England in January of 1943, packed in wooden crates aboard cargo vessels that ran the North Atlantic at 14 knots between the wolf packs. The 56th Fighter Group came across at the same time aboard the requisitioned liner Queen Elizabeth. They landed at Gourock in Scotland on the 11th of January and rode the trains south into East Anglia in the winter dark. Their commanding officer was a man named Hubert Zemke. He was 29 years old that January. He had been born in Missoula, Montana, on the 14th of March, 1914, the only child of 2 German immigrants named Anna and Benno. His parents had spoken German at the kitchen table for as long as he could remember. He had grown up bilingual in a town that did not always appreciate it. After the First World War, boys on his block had beaten him for the language his mother used. He had learned to fight before he had learned to fly. He had joined the Army Air Corps in 1936 and gone to Kelly Field in Texas as a pursuit pilot the following year. In 1940, he had been sent to London as an observer to watch the Royal Air Force and the Luftwaffe punch at each other over the English Channel. In 1941, he had been sent to Moscow to train Soviet pilots in the P-40 Tomahawk. He had come home in the spring of 1942, speaking passable Russian to go with his German. In September of that year, they had given him a fighter group. He had gone to look at the aircraft his group would fly. He had climbed into the cockpit of a Thunderbolt at Bridgeport, Connecticut, and taken it up. He had brought it back down. He had climbed out onto the wing route and looked at his crew chief and said very little. He was not impressed. The airplane was heavy. The airplane was slow in a climb. The airplane rolled sluggishly and would not turn tightly at any altitude he had tried. He wrote in his notes that it did not maneuver like a fighter should. He asked his superiors, more than once, whether the group could be re-equipped with something else. The answer came back that there was nothing else. The Thunderbolt was what the army had bought, and the army was going to fly it. So Zemke had taken his group to England and set them down at a base called King's Cliff, and, a few weeks later, at another called Horsham St. Faith. And he had begun to think about how a heavy fighter that could not turn might still be made to kill. His pilots were not thinking about killing yet. His pilots were thinking about surviving. The Royal Air Force flyers at the nearby bases flew Spitfires. The Spitfires were half the weight of the Jug and turned twice as tight. When American pilots and British pilots drank together in the pubs of Norwich and Ipswich, the British pilots asked the Americans, with the particular gentleness the British reserved for hopeless cases, what it was like to fly a bathtub. Some of the Americans put in requests to transfer to Spitfire squadrons. Some of them wrote home, saying they expected to die in their first month of combat. The first combat mission came on the 13th of April, 1943. A sweep over Saint-Omer in occupied France. No enemy contact. The 56 turned around and came home. The second sweep, the same. The third, the same. The Luftwaffe was watching them and choosing not to engage. That went on into June. And then, on the afternoon of the 26th of that month, 48 Thunderbolts took off from a forward base at Manston on the Kentish coast to meet a formation of B-17 flying fortresses, coming back from a raid on the airfield at Villers-Coublay in the southern suburbs of Paris. The bombers were tired. The bombers were low on ammunition. The bombers were going to need protecting. The rendezvous point was near a small French town called Forges-les-Eaux in Normandy, about 40 miles inland from the coast. The 56th reached it and began to circle, and Galland's second group of fighter wing, 26, 16 Focke-Wulfs strong, climbed above them into the sun. The Germans had picked their moment. They had picked their altitude. They had picked the direction the American pilots were least likely to look. They came down together in a single dive. The first pass scattered the 56th into small groups of 2 and 3. Cannon shells walked across canopies. Cannon shells walked across engine cowlings. A thunderbolt in the middle of the formation began to trail smoke and rolled into a spin from which it did not recover. Another lost a wingtip and went end over end. A third pilot bailed out and drifted down toward the fields of Normandy in a white parachute. At the rear of the 61st Squadron, in a Thunderbolt he had brought all the way from Connecticut, Robert Johnson looked up in time to see the Focke-Wulf coming down on him from above. He had flown only a handful of combat missions. The Focke-Wulf fired. You already know what happened to Johnson. What you may not know is what happened next. In the middle of the spin, in the middle of the fire, with the canopy jammed shut and the flames climbing toward his face, he did the only thing left to do. He kicked left rudder. He pulled back on the stick. The Thunderbolt came out of the spin. The fire went out. The engine kept running. 5 Thunderbolts went into the Channel or into the fields of France that afternoon. 4 American pilots died. Robert Johnson, bleeding from his leg and his face and his nose, flew his ruined aircraft back to England on instruments he could barely read through the smoke damage on the panel. He landed at Manston without hydraulics and rolled to a stop at the end of the runway with the engine still turning over. The ground crew counted the holes. They stopped counting past 200. That evening, in the ready rooms of Fighter Wing 26, the German pilots wrote up their after-action reports. They had lost nothing. They had shot down 5 of the new American fighters and driven off the rest. The intelligence estimate of that spring, the one that had called the 7-ton American fighter a manageable opponent, appeared to have been confirmed. They did not know about the boy from Lawton. They did not know that a Thunderbolt had taken 21 cannon shells and a fire and a spin and come home. They did not know that the machine they had shot to pieces had refused to die. The report on Johnson's aircraft reached Hubert Zemke's desk at Horsham St. Faith 3 days later. Cannon shells, over 200 machine gun holes, hydraulics gone, canopy shattered, fuselage skin peeled back in strips along the port side. The Republic Aviation representatives who came out from the depot to look at the airframe stood on the concrete apron and shook their heads. They had built the aircraft. They had not expected it to survive that. Zemke walked around the wreck of the Thunderbolt with a notebook in his hand. He did not say much. He never said much. He looked at where the cannon shells had gone in, and he looked at where they had come out, and he looked at the engine, which was still bolted to its mount and still capable of running. He wrote one line in his notebook that afternoon: "The airplane will not die." He walked back to the operations building and sat down at his desk and began to think. The pilots he had lost on the 26th of June had died the way. Pilots always died against the Focke-Wulf. They had tried to turn with the Germans. The physics of the fight were simple and cruel. A Focke-Wulf Waventinity at 15,000 feet could complete a full circle in 22 seconds. A Thunderbolt at the same altitude needed 28 6/10 seconds. 6 seconds was the distance between a man who came home and a man who did not. Zemke wrote that number down too. He had known it before the mission. His pilots had known it before the mission. But there had been no other way to fight, because a fighter was supposed to turn, and every doctrine written in every air force in the world since the First World War said so. He sat at his desk in the June evening, and he did what almost no fighter commander in the war had ever done. He threw out the doctrine. The Thunderbolt could not turn. Fine, he would stop asking it to turn, but it could do something else. At 25,000 feet, a Focke-Wulf's engine began to lose power. The German fighter used a mechanical supercharger, and the supercharger ran out of atmosphere at high altitude, and the power curve fell away. At the same altitude, the Thunderbolt's Pratt & Whitney was breathing through a General Electric turbocharger fed by exhaust gas, and the turbocharger did not care about the thin air. Above 20,000 feet, the Thunderbolt made 2,000 horsepower. The Focke-Wulf made less than 1,500. And the Thunderbolt weighed 7 tons. 7 tons falling was not a weakness. 7 tons falling was a weapon. In a straight dive from 30,000 feet, nothing in the sky over Europe could catch the jug. It would accelerate past 400 miles an hour, past 450, past 500. Its thick wing and heavy structure would hold together at speeds that would tear the skin off a Messerschmitt. He wrote it out on the yellow notepad, the way an engineer writes a proof. Get above them. Come down out of the sun. Fire once. Keep going. Do not stop. Use the speed you gained falling to climb back to altitude. Repeat. Never turn. Never slow down. Never fight the fight the Germans wanted to fight. He walked out of the operations building that night and stood on the airfield in the dark. The bombers were coming back from a raid on Wilhelmshaven, and he could hear the 4-engine notes of the fortresses passing overhead, low and heavy and staggered. He listened to them, and he thought about what he was going to ask his pilots to do. He was going to ask them to unlearn everything they had been taught about air combat. He briefed the group the next morning. Some of them looked at him as if he had lost his mind. A few of the older hands, men who had flown P-40s in California and Curtiss Hawks before the war, did not like being told that the doctrine they had trained under for a decade was wrong. Zemke did not argue with them. He gave them the numbers on the yellow pad, and he told them that any pilot who tried to turn with a Focke-Wulf was going to die, and that he was not going to preside over any more funerals if he could help it. Through July and into August, the 56th practiced diving attacks on tow targets, high-speed passes from altitude, zoom climbs back to Angels 30, over and over until the movements were in their hands and not their heads. They flew their combat missions in between. Bomber escorts to Amiens, to Rouen, to the coast of Belgium. Small skirmishes with Focke-Wulfs. Kills came in ones and twos. Losses came the same way. The group was learning, but the Germans did not yet know they were learning. That was about to change. On the 17th of August, 1943, the 8th Air Force sent 376 B-17s against 2 targets deep inside Germany, 230 against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, 146 against the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg. It was the deepest penetration raid the Americans had attempted. It was, by any accounting, the moment when the strategic bombing campaign either worked or did not. The 56th Fighter Group put 51 Thunderbolts into the air that morning. Their assignment was withdrawal escort, meet the returning fortresses over the Netherlands, cover them home. The Luftwaffe put up everything it had. Among the units that scrambled from their bases in Belgium and northern France that morning was Galland's second group of Fighter Wing 26, the same second group that had bounced Robert Johnson's formation 8 weeks earlier over Forges-les-Eaux. Wutz climbed his Focke-Wulf out of the airfield at Vitry into the summer haze and turned northeast to intercept the bombers. Somewhere over the Dutch-German border, at high altitude, in the sun, his group ran into the Thunderbolts of the 56th. The Americans were above them. Captain Walker, Melville Mahurin, was 24 years old that morning. He was from Fort Wayne, Indiana. He flew with the 63rd Squadron. He was climbing back toward friendly airspace with the rest of the group when the call came over the radio that Focke-Wulfs were below them, forming up to attack the bombers. He rolled his Thunderbolt onto its back and pulled the nose through. The dive was almost vertical. He picked out a single Focke-Wulf in the German formation and held the sight on it as his airspeed built past 400 miles an hour. The German never looked up. The German was watching the bombers. Mahurin fired a long burst from all 850 calibers at 300 yards and pulled out with the tracers still walking across the target. The Focke-Wulf caught fire. It rolled onto its back and went down out of the formation in a slow spiral, trailing black smoke, and it did not come out of the spiral. The kill was later credited to Mahurin, though the paperwork on the German side never confirmed with complete certainty which Thunderbolt pilot had brought Galland down that afternoon. What is certain is that the Focke-Wulf, carrying the middle Galland brother, came down near the Dutch town of Maastricht in a field and burned there through the afternoon. He did not bail out. He was 28 years old. That evening, at his headquarters in Berlin, General Adolf Galland received the signal telling him that his second brother, the second of the three, had been killed by American fighter aircraft over the Low Countries. He did not speak of it that night. He wrote of it in his memoirs after the war, in a chapter about how badly the Luftwaffe had misjudged the fighter it had refused to name that spring. At Horsham St. Faith, No one knew that afternoon whose aircraft had gone down. The 56th landed and refueled and reloaded, and the intelligence officers took the gun camera film off to be developed. Mahurin filed his claim and went to the mess for coffee. The tactics worked. Over the last week of August and through September, the 56th flew 15 more combat missions. The kill tally climbed, 2 on the 24th of August, 3 on the 3rd of September, 9 on the 6th of September. The pattern held, always from above, always in the first pass, never a turning fight. When Focke-Wulfs came around to bring their guns to bear, the Thunderbolts were already climbing away. On the 2nd of October, Zemke got his 5th confirmed kill and officially became an ace. 2 days later, on the 4th of October, Walker Mahurin got his 5th. The 63rd Squadron had its ace as well. That was the day the month began. Between the 4th of October and the 14th of October, in 10 days of clear autumn weather over the Netherlands and northwestern Germany, the 56th Fighter Group shot down 34 German fighters. Focke-Wulf 190s from Fighter Wing 26, Messerschmitt 109s from Fighter Wing 3. Fighters that had been the terror of Europe for 4 years, dropping in 1s and 2s and 3s into the fields below. By the end of October, the total for the month was 39. The group lost 1 pilot in return, 39-1. The Luftwaffe pilots who came back from those missions did not laugh anymore. They filed their reports, and they went to their debriefings, and they described what they had encountered. A new American tactic. High-altitude attack. Diving passes at speeds their fighters could not match. Single firing runs, then extension away. No turning combat. No engagement they could into their own kind of fight. The Luftwaffe intelligence branch put a name on it. They called it Die Amerikanische Taktik, the American tactic. They wrote position papers about how to counter it. None of the position papers worked. They lowered the training hours for new pilots because they were running out of experienced fighter pilots and had to fill the cockpits with something. The new pilots, with 100 hours in the air, went up against Americans with 400 hours and found out very quickly what the difference was. At Horsham St. Faith, on the last day of October, Zemke went to look at the tally board in the operations room. 39 confirmed, 8 probables, 16 damaged, 1 aircraft lost. He stood there for a long moment. He did not smile. He knew, because he had grown up in a house where German was spoken, and he had read the newspapers from Berlin before the war, that the men he was killing were not caricatures. They were young men and grown men. They had wives in Hamburg and mothers in Munich and small children in Cologne who were being told that autumn of 1943 that their fathers would not be coming home. He knew what he had built. He knew what it was for. He walked out of the operations room and back to his quarters through the fog coming in off the North Sea, and the next morning he got up and briefed the group for another mission. The winter of 1943 settled over East Anglia in a grey weight that did not lift for weeks. Fog that came in off the North Sea in the morning and did not burn off until noon. Missions were scrubbed and rescheduled and scrubbed again. The 56th flew when the weather allowed and sat on the ground when it did not. In November, 8th Air Force Headquarters ordered Zemke to Washington. The Pentagon wanted him to brief the generals and the congressmen on what the 56th had done in October and how they had done it. He handed the group over to his deputy and took a transport home across the North Atlantic in weather that would have grounded any peacetime pilot. He was gone through December. While he was gone, The tacticians at Republic Aviation and at Wright Field were working on a problem that had nothing to do with dogfighting. The problem was fuel. The Thunderbolt in October had a combat radius of 230 miles. That was enough to escort bombers to the Ruhr and back. It was not enough to escort them to the targets that mattered. It was not enough to escort them to Leipzig. It was not enough to escort them to Berlin. The bombers that flew beyond escort range flew alone. In the last week of October, the second Schweinfurt raid had shown what that meant. 291 flying fortresses had gone to the ball-bearing factories. 60 had not come back. 600 American airmen killed or captured on a single afternoon. Zemke had been at 8th Air Force headquarters that day, receiving the British Distinguished Flying Cross. His group had claimed 16 German fighters in the escort phase, more than any other. It had not been enough. The engineers went back to the drawing board. They designed an external fuel tank of 150 gallons that could be hung under the belly of the Thunderbolt on shackles and dropped when it was empty. 2 more tanks of 108 gallons each could be hung under the wings. With all 3, the Thunderbolt's combat radius stretched from 230 miles to 425. Berlin was 450 miles from the English coast. It was almost enough. Zemke came back to the 56th in January of 1944 and found his group waiting for him and the new tanks waiting on the tarmac. He briefed the pilots on how to use them. Take off heavy, climb slowly over England, burn the external fuel first. Drop the tanks over the Dutch coast, cross into Germany at combat weight. The math worked on paper. Whether it worked in the air was another question. The answer came in the 3rd week of February, in what the planners called Big Week. 6 consecutive days of maximum effort raids against the German aircraft industry. Every bomber the 8th could put up, every escort fighter the 8th had, the largest air battle in the history of the world to that point. The 56th flew every day. Leipzig on the 20th, Brunswick on the 21st, Regensburg on the 25th. The Luftwaffe came up in numbers to defend. The Thunderbolts came down out of the sun the way they had come down in October. The diving pass, the single firing run, the extension away, never a turning fight. The kills came in, so did the losses. Big Week cost the 8th Air Force 226 heavy bombers and 28 fighters. It cost the Luftwaffe more than 300 aircraft and, worse for the Germans, more than 100 experienced pilots. Pilots the German training program could not replace. On the 2nd of March, 1944, a Thunderbolt of the 358th Fighter Group shot down a lone Focke-Wulf near Montmedy in eastern France. The pilot of the Focke-Wulf was Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, commander of Fighter Wing 2 Richthofen, 102 confirmed victories, the man who had developed the head-on attack against American heavy bombers. He had been one of the highest-scoring German pilots on the Western Front. He was 26 years old. His body was recovered from the wreckage. The American pilot who fired the fatal burst has never been identified with complete certainty. He was a young man flying a 47 of the 358th. He had less than a year of combat experience. He had, by his own account, no idea whom he had just shot down. That was becoming the pattern. The men the Germans had trained through the 1930s, the men who had ruled the sky over Poland and France and Britain, were being killed by American pilots with a fraction of their experience, flying an airplane the Germans had once dismissed. The Luftwaffe replacement stream could not keep pace. The training hours dropped. The new pilots died faster. 4 days after Meyer went down, on the 6th of March, the 8th Air Force sent 730 B-17s and B-24s against Berlin, of which about 660 reached the target area. It was the first American daylight raid on the German capital. The 56th was assigned the target support leg. They would meet the bomber stream over central Germany and cover it through the target area and out again. It was the longest fighter escort mission any American group had flown. It was the deepest penetration any American fighter had made into the Reich. Zemke led the group personally. They crossed the Dutch coast at 30,000 feet with their bellies feeding fuel to the engines. He over Holland. The tanks came off, over 100 of them, tumbling toward the winter fields below. The Thunderbolts crossed into Germany at combat weight and turned east toward the capital. They picked up the bombers over Dummer Lake, southwest of Bremen, and the Luftwaffe came up to meet them. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts in groups of 8 and 12 and 20, climbing to intercept. Zemke saw them below the bomber stream and rolled his Thunderbolt into a dive. The gun camera film from that engagement survives in the archives. It shows a single Focke-Wulf framed against grey German farmland, growing rapidly larger in the sight reticle. The tracers walk toward it and across it. The German fighter's cowling comes apart and pieces flutter back past the camera, and the aircraft rolls onto its back and falls out of the frame. That was Zemke's first kill of the day. He got a Messerschmitt 8 minutes later. Behind him, across a piece of sky 40 miles wide, the 56th fought the deepest air battle they had ever fought. 18 German fighters went down over Dummer Lake and the countryside around it. 2 Thunderbolts did not come home. The bombers reached Berlin. 69 of them did not come back from the target that day. The German capital's flak took most of them. The fighters took some. It was a heavy day, a very heavy day, and 8th Air Force headquarters counted the losses that evening with grim faces. But something had happened over Germany that had never happened before. American single-engine fighters had flown to Berlin. They had covered the bombers over the capital of the Third Reich. They had fought the Luftwaffe on the Luftwaffe's own front doorstep. They had come home. The Jug had done that. Less than a year after Galland had set his intelligence sheet aside at Vitry without a comment. Less than a year after his brother pilots at Fighter Wing 2 had done the same at Beaumont. The fighter they had refused to name had put its wheels down over Berlin. The Luftwaffe knew what it meant. Adolf Galland, at his headquarters, understood immediately. The Reich no longer had safe skies. Every industrial target was now an escorted target. Every daylight bomber was now a bomber. The fighters could not attack without paying for it. His memoirs, written after the war, contain a passage that historians still quote. He wrote that the day the American fighters reached Berlin was the day he knew the air war was lost. He did not blame the men in his cockpits. He blamed himself and the men who had briefed him in the spring of 1943 that the P-47 was not a serious opponent. By the summer of 1944, the 56th Fighter Group had become the most successful fighter unit in the European theater. Its pilots produced ace after ace. Francis Gabreski of Oil City, Pennsylvania, the son of Polish immigrants, 28 confirmed kills. Robert Johnson, the boy from Lawton, 27. David Schilling of Traverse City, Michigan, 22 and a half. Walker Mahurin, the man who had almost certainly killed Galland, 20 3/4. 39 of the group's pilots became aces. No other group in the 8th Air Force produced that many. But the total was not one man's total, and Zemke was the first to say so. It was the total of 3 fighter squadrons, the 61st and the 62nd and the 63rd. It was the total of the ground crews who kept the Thunderbolts flying through the English winter of '44 with their hands frozen to their wrenches. It was the total of the mechanics who patched the airframes after the missions, and the armorers who fed the 50 caliber ammunition into the wing bays before dawn. It was the total of the intelligence officers who briefed the pilots on the German fighter dispositions and the operations officers who wrote the mission orders. By the end of the war, the 56th Fighter Group would be credited with 677.5 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. It was the highest total of any American fighter group in Europe, 100 more than the second-place group. Zemke would not be there to see the final tally. On the 12th of August, 1944, he was transferred to the 479th Fighter Group, a struggling unit that 8th Air Force Headquarters wanted him to fix. He handed the 56th over to David Schilling and moved to the new base. The 479th flew P-51 Mustangs. He learned the new airplane in a week and began flying combat missions in it. On the 30th of October, 1944, he took the 479th on an escort mission over central Germany. The weather was bad and getting worse. A storm system was building over the Reich, and the mission should probably have been scrubbed. It was not scrubbed. Zemke took his group into the weather. Over Germany, he flew his Mustang into a thunderhead. The turbulence tore the right wing of his aircraft off at the root. He bailed out at 18,000 feet and drifted down through the storm and landed in a forest on German soil. He evaded for 3 days, moving at night, hiding in the woods during the day, trying to make his way west. On the 2nd of November, a German patrol found him. He spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft 1 on the Baltic coast near Bath as the senior American officer among 9,000 Allied airmen prisoners. He was 30 years old. He came home in May of 1945. The 56th flew its last combat mission on the 21st of April, 1945. 18 days later, Germany surrendered. The final numbers for the group came in over the summer: 447 combat missions, 19,391 individual sorties, 64,332 hours in the air, 677.5 German aircraft destroyed in the air, 311 destroyed on the ground. 128 of the group's own Thunderbolts had not come back. The heavy fighter the Luftwaffe pilots had laughed at in the spring of 1943, the one they had refused to name, ended the war as the highest-scoring American fighter type in the European theater by air-to-air victory total. It had killed more of them than any other American aircraft in the sky over their country. In Bochum, a family named Galland had lost 2 of its 3 fighter pilot sons. Paul on a Belgian afternoon in October of '42, Wutz over the Dutch fields in August of '43. Adolf survived the war and lived until 1996. In Constance, a family named Meyer waited for a son who had died over the eastern French countryside in March of '44. In Missoula, Montana, a mother named Anna Zemke, who had spoken German at her kitchen table for 40 years, received a telegram in November of 1944 telling her that her only child was missing over Germany. She waited 7 months to learn that he was alive. He came home to her that summer. The men who had laughed at the Thunderbolt in the spring of 1943 were not laughing when the war ended. Most of them were not alive to laugh. The airplane they had dismissed had gone on flying and killing and coming home, and it had done that from the airfields of East Anglia in the spring of 43 to the airfields of central Germany in the spring of 45, without ever once being asked to be what it was not. It had never turned with a Focke-Wulf. It had never needed to.